XY with Joan of Arc Prime has established itself as one of the strongest cavalry marches in Rise of Kingdoms. But with XY's lower rage requirement and lower rage requirement, and the way Joan of Arc Prime casts her skills, builds up rage, and casts her skills again, we have to ask ourselves some questions like, are we overraging with this build? How important is Horn of Fury on this build? And what is the optimal talent setup to maximize the efficiency with our rage? Well, I've got all the answers for you in this video, so stick around. What's up, everybody? Psycho here on the Rise of Kingdoms video. I've talked a lot about Joan of Arc recently and the uniqueness of her skills. In my most recent video, I talked about Alexander Nevsky with Joan of Arc. It's probably the #1 best cavalry march in the game right now, Nevsky with Joan of Arc Prime. But the thing is that we don't always run that cavalry march. In fact, if we have 2 cavalry marches, we might have Nevsky paired with William already, and that leaves XY Joan as our second cavalry march, which leaves us with some questions about how should we set this march up. And you can check out that other video if you want to see how to set up your Nevsky Joan of Arc Prime. But if you have the XY Joan of Arc Prime, you might be wondering, what is the right way to set this up? So look, as I mentioned in the intro, XY is unique because he reduces the amount of rage that we need. Joan of Arc fires these skills over and over again. She, in fact, fires that first skill 3 times, where you get 3 skill casts on your first skill cycle, which means you get extra rage from Rejuvenate, you get extra rage from her first skill, and if you have a Horn of Fury, just how valuable is that? Well, I did all the tests here just like I did on the Nevsky video, and I'm not going to go through all of that again because I realized that is a lot to cover. I'm not going to talk about rage and rage capping and how all of that works. Instead here, I'm just going to tell you I did the exact same set of tests, but I want to add a couple of caveats so that people really understand what we're doing here. The first is that we're not testing every possible scenario, right? So there are scenarios where you are surrounded, and when you're surrounded, you take more damage and you get more counterattack rage, and you will build rage faster. I'm not including in these simulation scenarios where you're getting buffs from William or you're getting a buff from Trajan that's overriding the Joan of Arc buffs. And so in real world scenarios, that stuff can happen. I'm also not even looking at scenarios where you're losing and you're going to be getting more rage from attacks and counterattack damage. I'm just going to stick with the same set of scenarios I looked at in the last one, just so that we can get a relative feel for how valuable Horn of Fury is and just how important are certain talent builds when we are winning in a sort of 1v1 kind of situation where we're not getting all that extra counterattack rage, where we're not surrounded or swarmed. Now, the second caveat I want to talk about concerns these talent builds. The reality here is we're talking about micro optimizations with this march, right? So look, right now I've got 5 points in Feral Nature. If we put that down to 3 points, how much of a difference would it make? That's one of the things we're going to be talking about here. But really, unless you're choosing really terrible talents, like unless you're coming out here to get increases of troop load or coming out here to get Tier of Blessing and using this march in the open field, you're really going to be just fine with any of these kind of setups. There's a few setups that are a little bit better, a few setups that are a little bit worse, but these are, again, really micro optimizations. So look, if you're trying to get the absolute maximum best trade you possibly can, this is the kind of video you want to check out. If you're trying to just get that little tiny extra edge in an Ark of Osiris mid-fight, these are the kind of optimizations you might want to put in. But at the end of the day, these really aren't going to make a huge difference in your march's performance, but just little tiny differences that might show up over a long period of time. Okay, with that being said, I want to jump in to show you a little bit about the Rage Simulator, just so you can see what I'm talking about and how this Rage Simulator actually works, and so you can see that I'm not just blowing smoke at you and making all of this up. So I use a program called R here, and I'm going to pull that up to show you what this Rage Simulator looks like. I'm going to go ahead and clear the window real quickly. And I will jump over here to this XY Joan. This is just an example of the simulation. It's just a function that I've written. You can see I can set a whole variety of parameters here. I'm going to set this one to 60 turns, a 60-turn battle. We've set the rage requirement to 849. XY's is 850, but because of rounding, 849 works. We've got 9 points in Burning Blood. We've got 9 points in Undying Fury. That's Talent 1 and Talent 2. We've got 60 points in Rejuvenate. That is 3 points, 3 talent points in Rejuvenate. So we get 60 rage for that. I've got no rage from Feral Nature. So this is a build with no Feral Nature right now. And I've got 50 points in Horn of Fury. That is, we have a Horn of Fury and it is not special talented. And I've listed Joan Prime as the secondary commander, and she's giving us 20 rage per second for 3 seconds. That's what this is all telling us. And so if I just run this little function, you can see how quickly it generates the results. And the reality is I do this for each of these scenarios, right? So I've just done this one with 0 and Feral Nature. I'll run that one 10,000 times and save all of the results and then aggregate across those results. That's what you're going to see here in a little bit. But then I do that for every one of these scenarios, all 48 of the scenarios that I tested for Nevsky. I'm testing again here for XY Joan. So you can ignore the first 5 lines of this. That's just getting the simulation set up. The action really starts here on turn 1. And on turn 1, you see we're getting 86 rage from attack and 16 rage from counterattack. That's base rage. John Wick showed us how to calculate this and where this comes from in a video some time ago. We get 9 rage from one talent, 9 rage from the other talent. That's Burning Blood and Undying Fury. We're getting no rage from Rejuvenate, of course, because we didn't cast the skill. We are getting 50 rage in this extras column. The extras column is where I list things like Horn of Fury and things like Joan of Arc's rage buff. I add them all up and put them in that column. You can see that we got a Horn proc on turn 1. And again, this is just a random set. I just said go, and this is what we generated here. So we generated 170 rage on turn 1, and that gives our March a total of 170 rage. And obviously, we didn't proc any skills or trigger any skills here on this turn. Turn 2, we get the same kind of thing. We didn't get a Horn proc. Turn 3, same thing, no horn proc. We did get a Horn proc on turn 4, and we also got a Horn proc on turn 6. And what that means is that on turn 6, we actually got over that 850 threshold, and so we have triggered our active skill. And that means we're going to cast the active skill on the next turn. And you can see that on turn 7, XY Joan, which, by the way, turn 7 active skill, skill activation is pretty good result, as we'll see here in a little bit. So we got pretty lucky. We got 3 Horn procs right away. So that got us to a turn 7 activation. So we can see that XY casts his skill here, and that gives 60 rage from Rejuvenate. We get a second of downtime here where nothing happens, where we don't cast. We just have normal attacks. On the next turn, Joan of Arc Prime casts her skill. Again, we get 60 from Rejuvenate. And then again, we start getting a second of downtime, but notice that we get 20 rage here. That's from Joan of Arc's primary skill, Sacred Banner. We're getting 20 rage, we're getting 20 rage, we're getting 20 rage. For the next 3 turns, we get those 20 rage. But also notice that after that second of downtime, her 4th skill activates and we cast Sacred Banner again, getting another 60 rage from Rejuvenate and restarting the count on our on Sacred Banner's rage regeneration. So we notice we're getting another 20 rage here. That's actually from the second cast of Sacred Banner. And so we've got enough actually that we just procced our skill again. That is, we've got enough rage that XY is going to cast on his next turn. So look at this. We're casting a skill. We have a second of downtime. We're casting a skill. We have a second of downtime. We're casting a skill. We have a second of downtime. And we're casting a skill again here on turn 13. That's 4 skill casts in 13 turns. That's just crazy, incredible, right? And we're going to get a 5th skill cast in 15 turns, right? So 1/3 of the turns of the fight now, we're casting a skill. Notice we got a Horn proc. We got a Horn proc. We're still getting that rage from Joan of Arc's skill cast back here. And then, okay, we cast the skill, we get Rejuvenate rage again, and we got a Horn proc, and again, we're getting Joan of Arc's rage here. And again, we've got enough rage again on turn 17 to restart this cycle. And here's where things kind of get interesting. We actually are going to cast our skill here on turn 18, and on turn 19, where we have a second of downtime, and again, we're casting it again on, this is Joan of Arc's Sacred Banner skill. And what we should see here, because this is turn 20, it's sort of it's sort of hidden here because we're casting the skill on turn 20. And on turn 21, we have a second of downtime. And what we should see is this is the 3rd skill cycle. We should see Joan of Arc casting her skill again here on turn 22. And actually she is. It's actually hidden in here. It says trigger because we're also generated enough rage to restart the skill cycle. But what we should see here is actually Sacred Banner proc again. That 4th skill is procking here. And that's why we're getting 60 rage from Rejuvenate. And these skills are firing. So the point here is XY with Joan is just unreal in terms of how fast it fires off its skills. Okay, so that's a little bit about how the Rage Simulator works. That's how we get to the results that we get to. So let's jump over to those results right now. And I'm jumping over to this Excel screen where I have summarized the results again from all of these different tests we did. We tested every iteration of Feral Nature. We tested every iteration of putting points in Burning Blood. I think it's the Cavalry talent. It's either Burning Blood or Undying. I always get mixed up which one it is. I think it's Burning Blood, but it might be Undying Fury. Anyway, we tested all of the iterations of that against all of the iterations of Feral Nature, putting points in Feral Nature versus no points versus 5 points and all of that. We tested 24 builds with the Horn of Fury. We tested 24 builds here without the Horn of Fury. And let's just sort of cut to the big picture things. And I've looked through all of this to try to understand what's sort of most optimal. A couple of things are really obvious right away. We can see that our acceleration, that is how quickly did we get our first skill. Remember in that little test run we did, we had a 7-second, like, look how good that is. Like the average acceleration in all of these builds, even in ones with Feral Nature, it's rarely achieving 7 seconds. In fact, that actual build that we had was this one right here. It's build number, test number 19 is that same build that we just used. A 7-second proc actually happens 25.5% of the time. So we were a little lucky to get it there. We didn't get the amazingly lucky 6-second proc, which happens extremely rarely. But that's what these show you here is at what turn did the first skill fire. This is the average, right? What's the turn on average of the first skill fired? And this is the skill cycle. So after that first skill proc, how quick was the skill cycle, turn after turn after turn? And so that's what I mean when I look down here at the summary of results. When we have the Horn of Fury, we fire off about 0.8 seconds faster with the Horn of Fury, our first skill, and we're about half a second faster per cycle. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't make any sense because we don't fire on the half seconds. You're exactly right. And so a couple of things to point out here. One is that basically in practice, this means the median first skill fire is going to be about 1 second faster. Your typical skill cycle fire is going to be about 8 seconds with the Horn of Fury versus if you don't have the Horn of Fury with this March, your typical skill fire, your first fire is going to be about 9 seconds. That's typical. It's not on average, but it's the one you're most likely to see. When it comes to skill cycle, this is where things I think get really interesting, and you can actually kind of see it very obviously. These are all of the this is all of the setups without the Horn of Fury. Notice that the median skill cycle, that is the time between the first skill and a reactivation of that skill, and the reactivation, the reactivation of those cycles is 6 seconds for every single one of these builds without the Horn of Fury. But if we have the Horn of Fury, there's only a couple of exceptions there at the very top, or ones where we really don't have a lot of points in other rage functions. But for the most part, we're seeing 5-second skill cycles. And that's what we saw in that little simulation that I showed where we have that was, which test was it here? Test 19. In that simulation, we saw a 5-second skill cycle going off for this margin. That's kind of what we would expect with this setup, right? So 5-second skill cycles on XY Joan of Arc, I think it's just crazy. So this is really just rapid fire AoE skill damage. This is why people really, really like the XY with Joan of Arc Prime March. Now, the question then is, what should I do with Feral Nature? Should I be putting any points in Feral Nature? Am I getting value out of that, or am I going over the Rage Cap? So here's all of our information about Rage Cap. All of that kind of stuff is in columns L through P over here. It's actually probably kind of hard to interpret, but what I've done here is actually sort of summarized where you're getting the most value out of Feral Nature. So if we go from 0 points in Feral Nature to 1 point, which gives us 20 rage, so we're getting 0 rage in Feral Nature versus 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, right? So this is all about adding 1 more point. If we add 1 point into Feral Nature, take it out of somewhere else and put it into Feral Nature, what is that effect on these two critical variables? One is our acceleration, how quickly do we fire our first skill? And then the second is our skill cycle, that is how quick is our cycle after the first one. And so if we look at our acceleration, we see that we get the biggest jump going from 20 to 40. So if we have 1 point in Feral Nature, we would actually get a pretty big jump in acceleration if we added a second point there. That's one of the biggest jumps. And you can kind of see that here when you look at lines 21 and 22, which is test 20 and 21. You can see that with only 20 in Feral Nature, we fire on turn 7 29% of the time. But if we put 40 in Feral Nature, all of a sudden we fire 44, 45% of the time. And why is that the case? Well, the reason is because of just how much rage we're getting from those base rage talents, the rage from Horn of Fury, how often we pick that up. And it seems like getting that 40 rage just pushes us over that 850 threshold often enough that it actually triggers it one turn faster. Remember, that's the real key with rage. It's not about getting as much rage as possible. It's getting as much rage as you need to just get over that rage requirement and no more. Any more than that is wasted, right? So you just want to just get over that rage requirement. So something that pushes you just over that rage requirement has the most value, the most returns. And that's what we see going from 20 to 40 has a pretty big return. Another place with a big return is going from 60 to 80. That is going from 3 points in Feral Nature to going to 4 points in Feral Nature. When we do that, we see that we actually get this amazing 3.8% chance of a 6-second turn 1 fire, which is just like, wow, that's pretty crazy. We also see about 50% of the time now we're firing on turn 7. For our first skill, which is really, really pretty impressive. And you can kind of see that here in the averages. 7.58 means that the typical fire you're going to see is on turn 8 or higher. 7.46 means the typical fire you're going to see is on turn 7 or lower, which is kind of interesting, right? So the typical fire is like sort of one gauge down for the first activation, that is for that acceleration. So that suggests to me that this build is pretty interesting. This one where you have 4 points in Feral Nature. Now you can go all the way out to 5 points in Feral Nature. You say, well, how bad is it to go out to 5 points in Feral Nature? And the answer is it's not that bad. One of the things that we see is that you actually increase that probability of firing on turn 6 by quite a bit, which is kind of interesting. But you're not really gaining much. You're not gaining anything really at all in terms of your cycle speed. And that's kind of true for all of these. You don't really gain much in cycle speed, but the gain is pretty marginal, I think, from going to 80 to 100 in Feral Nature. You could save that point. You're really getting the most bang for your buck going with 4 points in Feral Nature. So, all right, so what does this mean in terms of how we are going to set up our build? Let me jump back over to the talent build for XY. So you can see that I've got this one with 5 points. That's this last one that I just showed you. Probably a more optimal build is probably something that looks like this. Now you may say, oh, I don't want these points here, and that's actually very reasonable. But one with 4 points in Feral Nature does seem to be really effective. Maybe you want to come up here and get Emblazoned Shield to reduce the skill damage taken. This talent is actually pretty good, reducing the counterattack damage, particularly if you are not being targeted. Your march can really go crazy. This talent I'm not that crazy about. It really only works at the start of the fight. The thing is with XY and Joan, and the way they scale up the rage, you can actually, if you're not getting targeted, stay at 90% for a while, and adding 9% damage to that triple skill cycle is actually pretty insane. So there's a reason to go for this build if you prefer, but some people might prefer one that's just a little bit more tanky. Not this one here. Let's go ahead and actually reset this build to go with what I would consider to be perhaps one of the most rage optimal builds, one that sort of handles skill damage the best as well. That's one problem right now, is the skill damage and the AoE is kind of crazy in Rise of Kingdoms. And so talents like Emblazoned Shield really help a lot, because if you're just standing around or nearby in a murder ball and taking skill damage, you're actually going to get pretty deleted even without anybody targeting you. So talents like this actually help quite a bit. I think it's the same thing for, is it this talent here? Yeah, reduces skill damage taken there as well. So those talents are pretty good in the current meta. So this is probably, I put 5 points there, and which is the same. Okay, so I screwed all of that up. I did not mean to do that. Let's go back and try it one more time. Let's just put 4 points into this. Let's get Emblazoned Shield. And then let's get Undying Fury, because we know that based on the simulations, that seems to have a lot of value. And then we're going to get Halberd, which again is really, I've talked about this before, is really strong against archers. And then for the last point, you kind of have some choices. You can get 0.5% attack. That doesn't really make any sense. So you can get 1% there. That's probably the best place to go. You can also do some other things, like this won't actually work on that march. This will actually increase the skill damage you deal, which maybe it's I mean, in terms of trades, it's better. You're obviously going to lose a little bit of tankiness, but for XY Joan, it's dishing out so much skill damage. I don't think anybody can compete with you in skill damage. So it actually might be a reasonable option to put 1 point there in Naked Rage. But I think probably the simplest thing to do is just put 1 point there in attack. And I think that's probably the most optimal, rage optimal build you can get for this March of XY and Joan. So look, to summarize, a couple of things that we learned. One is that the Horn of Fury is just amazing. It just shows up so good on so many marches. There just doesn't seem to be a place where you go, man, you really don't want a Horn of Fury there. It just seems like you always want it. Getting that extra 50 rage really makes a big difference on this XY with Joan of Arc March as well. And then the other big thing we've learned is that this is sort of the rage optimal talent build is this one right here. If you're trying to sort of get those micro optimizations to give you just the tiniest bit of extra edges in KVK or Ark of Osiris mid fights. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you like this kind of video, make sure to like the video. Comment down below that you want more. I'm looking at also, I've run some simulations on running Joan of Arc Prime as the primary commander and what kind of talent builds you can use there and how to sort of optimize that if you're in a situation where you want to run her as the primary commander. If you want to see that kind of content, leave a comment so that I can keep making these kind of videos for you all. Thanks so much for coming by, and I will see you all in the next one.